We're here today to continue with the study on Canada-U.S. trade and dealing with investment issues and Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. We have as our witnesses today from the Association of International Automobile Manufacturers of Canada, David Adams, President. From the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters, Mary Anderson, President, and Carol Osmond, Senior Policy Advisor. And we have from the Council of Canadians, Maud Barlow, National Chairperson. So we will start with the presentations. I will enforce the 8-minute limit on presentations. They've been sneaking, kind of get a little bit longer over the past few meetings. So I'd ask you to respect the 8-minute time limit. And then when you're finished, we'll go directly to questions. I will have we will go in the order that you are on the agenda, so starting with David Adams for 8 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, honourable members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today to review Canada-U.S. trade and investment issues in the Security and Prosperity Partnership. By way of background, the Association of International Automobile Manufacturers of Canada is the national trade association that represents the Canadian interests of 13 international automobile manufacturers that distribute, market, and manufacture vehicles in Canada. In 2006, AIMC members sold over 733,000 new vehicles in Canada, representing 45% of Canada's new vehicle market. Additionally, our members sold 61% of all passenger cars in Canada. While our members' sales have grown, so has their Canadian investment. AIMC members have invested over $6 billion in manufacturing facilities alone. Annual production reached a record of 900,839 new vehicles in 2006 out of the 2.58 million vehicles produced by the 3 member companies with production facilities in Canada, which are Honda, Toyota, and Suzuki through a 50-50 joint venture with General Motors in Ingersoll. While the majority, 77% of the vehicles produced by our member companies are exported out of the country, almost exclusively to the United States, each of these companies sell more of the vehicles that they build in Canada to Canadians. For instance, 45% of Honda and Acura vehicles sold in Canada were produced at Honda of Canada Manufacturing, and 36% of Toyota and Lexus vehicles sold in Canada were built at Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada. Further, compared to other companies producing in Canada, these 3 companies have a higher percentage of their NAFTA production in Canada. While many would view the membership of the AIMC as being importers in the context of the NAFTA, fully 50% of AIMC member sales in Canada in 2006 were produced in the NAFTA region, and when Kia's recently announced $1.2 billion plant is open for full production in 2009, Porsche will be the only one of our 13 members not producing vehicles in the NAFTA region. If we look specifically at Canada, which is a necessary thing to do in light of some of the SPP initiatives, it's important to remember that Canada has no Indigenous auto manufacturers. All manufacturers manufacturing in Canada are subsidiaries of multinational companies, whether these companies have their head offices in Detroit, Stuttgart, or Tokyo. They're all foreign-owned. Some have just been operating here longer. The SPP is comprised of about 107 key initiatives, 80 of which are oriented towards prosperity, as I'm sure you're aware, and 27 of which are oriented towards security, and there are about 300 work items associated with those 107 key initiatives. With respect to the automotive industry and the members of the AIMC, the issues pertaining to border facilitation, the development of a regulatory cooperation framework, and national critical infrastructure protection and emergency preparedness are of significance. The first 2 items I mentioned were to be pursued sectorally under the auspice of the Automotive Partnership Council of North America, which was originally intended to support the ongoing competitiveness of the automotive and auto parts sectors. Patterned after the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council, this initiative was to be up and running in late 2005, but membership and governance issues have hampered its development. The issues PCNA was envisioned to champion, however, have been advanced independently without the Council's formation. In the interest of time, I'll try and skip down a little bit further. As noted earlier, the vast majority of Canadian vehicle production is exported to the U.S., and likewise the vast majority of vehicles Canadians buy are imported from the U.S., Asia, and Europe. With respect to border facilitation, trade in automotive goods accounts for 25% of all two-way trade between Canada and the United States. The ease with which parts, components move across the border is an important component of an integrated North American supply chain. Unlike perhaps any other industry, 9/11 added cost, complexity, and thickness to the Canadian border as security measures were imposed on cross-border traffic. While many manufacturers have become FAST and CPAC approved to achieve low-risk status, the full benefits of those programs remain in many cases unrealized. While there are now about 20 border crossings with FAST capability, access to those FAST boosts at major border crossings has not yet been fully resolved. With respect to cross-border trade facilitation, it's widely acknowledged that pre-clearance away from the border prior to arrival at the border streamlines border crossings and minimizes delay. However, it has become apparent just last week that land pre-clearance still requires some work between Canadian and U.S. governments for it to move forward. However, we remain optimistic. Areas of concern to border facilitation is the imposition of the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative at the land borders, for instance, that will come into place no later than July 2009, which will require citizens who leave and enter the U.S. to produce secure identification documentation. While the American administration has suggested that it will show some flexibility, this requirement has the potential to cause significant backlogs at the border crossings. With respect to the regulatory framework, differing standards and regulations can be significant inhibitors to trade. The AIMC and its member companies are aware that the North American Competitiveness Council has focused much of its work on the development of a trilateral regulatory framework for cooperation, with a target date for realization prior to the end of this year. As an industry that is highly integrated on a North American basis, the concept of making standards and regulations in all three countries more compatible, as well as eliminating the need for redundant testing and certification procedures, is something we can fully support. Given its relatively small market size compared to the U.S., Canada is about 8% of the total North American auto market. Canada has always worked closely with U.S. regulators in both safety and emissions regulatory development. There have been 14 voluntary agreements between the automotive industry and the Government of Canada that have assisted in creating regulatory alignment with the United States. These voluntary agreements have allowed Canadian consumers to benefit from the most advanced safety and emissions technologies in vehicles at the lowest possible cost. Whether the standards are motor vehicle safety standards or fuel economy and emission standards, given that the vehicles offered for sale are essentially the same in Canada as the United States, there is no compelling reason why such standards should be different. Thus, we support the notion of the three countries working together to develop regulations that are as compatible as possible. This joint regulatory development process should also include the regulation of fuel quality. The automobile operates as a system, and the emissions control hardware on the vehicle will only operate as effectively as the quality of fuel that is combusted in the vehicle. In this regard, we were pleased to learn last week that Transport Canada and the Department of Transportation in the United States had signed a memorandum of cooperation concerning the research and development of a North American fuel economy standard. The objective, as we understand it, is to underpin the development of a stringent, dominant North American fuel economy standard for regulation beginning in 2011. A fuel economy regulation for Canada that is aligned with that of the United States provides the least disruption in the marketplace and best balances consumers' purchasing requirements pertaining to vehicle utility, safety, fuel economy, and emissions. The AIMC and its member companies, with respect to critical infrastructure protection and emergency preparedness, view this as critical. We're not only referring to border crossings, but also electricity generation, oil pipelines, dams, telecommunications in each country. We need to have protection strategies in place as quickly as possible. Due to the integrated nature of the North American economy, a failure in the key critical infrastructure components of any one country is likely to have a significant impact on trade and business in each of the other North American countries. Likewise, it is important for North American countries to establish individually and collectively an emergency preparedness plan so that in the event of an incident, emergency response officials know what needs to be done and how they can work together with the view to be very quickly able to address the human needs and within time to be in a position to outline when commerce can be recommenced based on the establishment of pre-incident protocols. I do have some other comments with respect to the actual recommendations of the committee, but in the interest of time, I'd be happy to answer questions on those later on. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Adams, pardon me, and on to Ms. Anderson. Are you presenting on behalf of the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters, I believe? Go ahead, please, for 8 minutes.
As President of IE Canada, the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the members for the opportunity to appear before the committee to discuss Canada-U.S. trade and investment issues. Joining me today is Carol Osmond, the Senior Policy Advisor for the Association. IE Canada has been the leading voice of the trade community since 1932. It serves small, medium, and large enterprises across Canada. Membership comprises importers and exporters as well as a range of service providers to Canada's trade community. We have a growing membership that now exceeds 800. In a recent survey conducted by Export Development Canada, EDC, 85% of 1,500 Canadian business executives surveyed agreed that international trade is important and a significant contributor to Canada's economy. However, no longer can simply expanding exports improve competitiveness. Imports are also an important engine of the Canadian economy. The import content used to make up Canadian exports has been growing steadily. 61% of Canadian exporters indicated that their companies' exports of products or services include imported component materials. If Canadian companies are to be globally competitive, there is a need to be both import and export, to use both. Therefore, in developing a Canadian trade policy, it is important to take into consideration that Canadian competitiveness depends on global supply chains, as many inputs are incorporated into those products from both domestic consumption as well as export to the United States and elsewhere are sourced globally. Given the nature of our association and its membership, our trading relationship with the United States, and especially our shared border, is clearly a key area of concern. Our association is a supporter of the Security Prosperity Partnership of North America, in particular initiatives intended to facilitate the movement of low-risk goods and persons across the Canada-US border. Even before the tragic events of 9/11, Canadian business was becoming increasingly concerned about delays associated and costs of crossing the Canada-US border and the impact on Canadian competitiveness. At the time, our challenge was to convince the U.S. government that the border was a problem that deserved its attention. We could never have foreseen how suddenly and dramatically our shared border would become a priority for the United States. There are still those in the United States that believe 9/11 terrorists entered the United States through Canada. The prosperity of Canadians and our ability to maintain and create jobs depends on our ability to trade, and in particular, our ability to trade with the United States. Whether we like it or not, the U.S. will set the terms for access to its market. Today, access to the U.S. market increasingly means satisfying U.S. concerns about security. Through mechanisms like this SPP, the Canadian government has the means of influencing the measures adopted by the U.S. to ensure that the interests of Canadians and Canadian business are taken into consideration. The cross-border relationships between businesses and associations such as those being developed through the North American Competitiveness Council, as well as independently through our sister associations in the two countries, like IE Canada's relationship with the American Association of Exporters and Importers, are also crucial to influence U.S. decision makers. We have to be constantly vigilant. Laws passed in the United States impact Canadians and have unanticipated ramification. The Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, the new APHIS, or Animal and Plant Inspection Service fees, are just two examples of initiatives that threaten and undermine the efforts to thin our border. However, it's not just maintaining access to the United States market, as pointed out earlier in the remarks by a representative by the Canadian Chamber before this committee last week. Canadians and Americans not only trade with one another, they also manufacture together. Since NAFTA, some 13 years ago, large sections of our economies have become highly integrated and our industries are becoming truly North American. 34% of bilateral shipments of goods is comprised of intercompany trade, and over 70% is comprised of inter-industry. To compete against emerging economic titans like China and India, Canada, the United States, and Mexico have no other choice but to work together. We recognize that members of this committee are concerned about transparency of the SPP process. There are over 300 action items under the SPP, i.e. Canada works most closely with the Canada Border Services Agency, which is involved with 100 of these. CBSA has had to establish priorities, which fortunately largely coincide with those of our members, and they include implementation of advanced commercial information, or e-manifest, to which the government recently committed $396 million over the next 5 years, establishment of bilateral border contingency and business resumption plans in the event of a pandemic, natural disaster, or terrorist act, and whether this could impact either a partial or complete shutdown of the border, and making Canadian partners in protection PIP compatible with the U.S. Customs and Border Partnership Against Terrorism, which will hopefully result with mutual recognition of these two programs. Members of our association have been involved and will continue to be involved actively in these consultations relating to these initiatives. We're a member of the CBSA Steering Committee on External Stakeholder Partnership. That network has been established by CBSA to develop consulting with the trade community. We've been involved in a variety of other projects with CBSA, including border contingency planning. We have our members that have participated in tabletop exercises, and our association has been part of the PIP program to make it compatible with CPAC. We are participating with consultations with Transport Canada on air cargo security, and we believe that this ensures success of these initiatives. It's essential to consult members of the trade community so that their concerns and business realities can be taken into consideration. We're very pleased with the excellent working relationship that we have with CBSA. We're also pleased with the level of consultation by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, which, as you know, serves as the Canadian Secretariat for the NAC, as it was preparing its report on enhancing competitiveness in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We were able to ensure that our members' concerns and priorities with respect to the border were incorporated into the report. We also contributed to the section on standards and regulatory cooperation, particularly in the areas of food and agriculture and intellectual property rights. Other key areas of concern for our members, in addition to those mentioned above, include border infrastructure. Our members are less concerned about border release times than the time it takes to reach the custom inspection booths, to do inadequate infrastructure at the leading points of entry at the ports. Other government departments, or OGDs. It is critical that other government departments on both sides of the border participate in programs to make the customs clearance fully electronic. It is also important that the government agencies and departments involved in security programs like CBSA and Transport Canada coordinate their efforts to avoid unnecessary duplication and costs of business. And transportation policy. A hefty surge in imports and exports during the last few years has been good news for Canada, as it's created jobs and economic growth. However, it also revealed the shortcomings in the country's transportation infrastructure and policies that need to be dealt with if Canada is to continue to be a player in world trade. It is appropriate that this committee take an interest in the SPP. We urge you to support the work that is being conducted by governments of the NAFTA countries under the SPP, and in particular initiatives that will facilitate the movement of low-risk goods and people across our shared border with the United States. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today, and we'd be very pleased to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson from the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters. And now from the Council of Canadians, Maud Barlow. Go ahead for 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you here today. Council of Canadians is Canada's largest public advocacy organization, and we have been working on the Security and Prosperity Partnership since before it was signed into effect in Waco in March 2005. In fact, since it was a twinkle in Tom Dicchino's eye. Security and Prosperity Partnership is not, as its proponents claim, about eliminating the tyranny of small differences among the 3 NAFTA countries. It is quite literally, we believe, about eliminating Canada's ability to determine independent regulatory standards, environmental protections, energy security, foreign military and immigration and other policies. We could speak on any of these, but I'm going to choose just to speak briefly on just 3. The first is the failure of the democratic process. A major concern of our organization and many Canadians, and we think should be of yours, is that the SPP process has been done without any parliamentary debate or public input. To date, the only stakeholders involved or consulted in the SPP process have been representatives of big business. Apparently, when it comes to the future of North America, the public doesn't count, nor do elected officials who, according to SPP documents, are only to be briefed after decisions are made. In a move that cements the primacy of big business in this process, the North American Competitiveness Council was created at the second of the meetings of the heads of state. In their own words, the NAC was created to engage substantively and pragmatically on trade and security issues without undue deference to political sensitivities. Ron Kovas of Lockheed Martin, one of the major companies of the NAC, told Maclean's magazine last fall, "We've decided not to recommend any things that would require legislative changes because then we wouldn't get anywhere." This came home to us last month when we met with senior officials of the U.S. Embassy at their request to talk about what our concerns were. And at that time, the officials told us clearly that there was no appetite, and I quote, "for another bruising NAFTA battle," and that was the reason that the SPP was not going before the legislatures of the 3 countries. I don't think there is any greater proof of the appalling lack of democracy that has characterized the SPP process than we should learn from the U.S. Embassy why the SPP is being withheld from Parliament. On the other hand, representatives of big business who are driving this process remain fully involved. All of Canada's representatives on NAC are members of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, led by Tom Dicchino, who also co-chaired the original task force on the future of North America that helped launch the SPP back in 2004 and 5. That task force recommendations, among many others, called for a North American resource strategy and was tabled only weeks before the SPP was signed in Waco, Texas. Second concern we have is around our water. While the NAC and our current government vehemently insist there are no discussions on Canadian bulk water exports currently underway, minutes from that original task force meeting clearly show that they were talking about it. These minutes got leaked to us at the Council of Canadians, and I quote, they said that they were the three governments were likely to meet with stiff resistance on water, Canadian water and Mexican oil, and they were therefore best considered long-term goals, and the task force members agreed that contentious or intractable issues would simply require more time to ripen politically. And since then, there have been a number of other statements made from American think tanks about Canada's water. Documents obtained by the Council of Canadians just several weeks ago describe a closed-door meeting of government officials and business representatives from the 3 countries, which took place last Friday in Calgary, where clearly bulk water exports were to be discussed. Under the title North American Future 2025 Project, the U.S. Centre for Strategic and International Studies, in collaboration with the Conference Board of Canada and the Mexican Research Institute, CIDE, was sponsoring a series of 7 closed-door roundtable meetings and this is their mandate, to strengthen the capacity of Canadian, U.S., and Mexican administrative officials and that of their respective legislators to analyze, comprehend, and anticipate North American integration. One of the roundtables, the one that was held on Friday, talked about creative solutions beyond the current transboundary water arrangements, which we're presuming mean the Treaty Act of 1909, and water consumption, water transfers, and artificial diversions of bulk water with the aim of achieving joint optimum utilization of the available water. It's very clear that what they're talking about is that Canadian water would now be North American water, just the way that Canadian oil is and gas is North American now. These meetings, which have been funded in part by the U.S. government and the private sector, and this was also confirmed to us by the U.S. Embassy, are about drafting policy, not making recommendations. According to the leaked documents, all three governments have agreed that there would be a tremendous benefit to the current decision makers if a roundtable on border issues could serve, and I quote, as the underpinnings to develop a blueprint for future border infrastructure and logistics systems as it relates to labor mobility, energy, the environment, by which they mean water, security, and competitiveness. This report is to be reviewed twice by the governments, and then it will be resubmitted in English, French, and Spanish with the aim of maximizing policy impact. Very briefly, we are also very concerned about the Resource Pact on energy. We are now sending well over 60% of our oil and gas to the United States, up from 25% before we signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, in which we signed a proportional sharing agreement. And the problem with the North American resource strategy proposed by the SPP is that it leaves Canadians victims of an official policy that renders Canada not only unwilling, but unable to provide for the energy needs of its country and its citizens now and in the future. It programs the Canadian government to fail in any effort to meet the international obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, as well as Parliament's obligations to its citizens to ensure that our natural resources are managed in the public interest. The push under the SPP and NAFTA to serve the corporate as opposed to the public interest explains, as much as anyone needs to have it explained, our current government's failure and refusal to develop a national environmental policy which would serve both Canada and its citizens. I'll leave you with 4 recommendations that we're calling for, and we believe we have broad support for this across the country. We're asking that the Government of Canada cease all talks leading toward deeper integration between Canada and the United States until there has been meaningful public consultation on the issue. We want a full disclosure of the complete listing of the Security and Prosperity Partnership working groups and the minutes of their meetings. We call on the government to disband the North American Competitiveness Council. Corporations such as Manulife Financial, Home Depot, Walmart, and Lockheed Martin should not have a say in shaping the economic policy between Canada and the United States and Canada's economic, social, and environmental policy here. And finally, we're saying bring the Security and Prosperity Partnership to the House of Commons for a full debate and a vote. The current government has promised that, and we quote, significant international treaties will be submitted to votes in Parliament. We submit the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America goes further than NAFTA, is going to have a more profound influence on Canada, and that we have the right to a debate and a full democratic process in our House of Commons. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Barlow. I would ask that you table with the committee the documents that were leaked to you that you referred to in your presentation. Thank you. We'll go now directly to the questioning, starting with Mr. Baines from the official opposition. Go ahead for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to thank all of you for your presentations and, again, bringing two very clear perspectives to the SPP. You know, it's got a very clear-cut mandate that we all recognize, and we've been talking about the importance that the Security and Prosperity Partnership has in terms of just cooperation and information sharing for better integration, and you alluded to that in terms of our export and how important imports are becoming of that export component. And I recognize that this is not a treaty or an accord. that this is nothing similar to what NAFTA is in terms of a binding agreement. However, there are issues around transparency and accountability, and I believe Ms. Barlow has alluded to those concerns. And so my question is really for Mr. Adams and yourself, Ms. Anderson. In terms of the changes, in the past, many of the committee members have discussed and said these are just incremental changes. These are very small initiatives. These are just harmonizing issues. These are regulatory issues. They're not major issues per se. But if you look at it in your presentation, Mr. Adams, you allude to there's 107 key initiatives that are currently being discussed under the SPP, and that there's 300 work items associated with those 107 key initiatives. So my view is that they're incremental changes, but they will have a profound impact overall once you combine all the initiatives and when they take full effect. So do you share that viewpoint, or do you still believe that they're just incremental changes and they're not as profound as people make them out to be?
I think in terms of the goal of the SPP is to try and have the whole North American economy, as I say, work in a more efficient and effective way. I think with respect to those issues that directly impinge upon the automotive industry, for instance, some standards harmonization issues, motor vehicle safety standards, for instance, in our view, those are minor changes that just need to be brought into an alignment.
So the 14 changes, for instance, sorry to interrupt, that you've indicated that there's been 14 volunteer agreements between the automotive industry and government of Canada.
Sure.
You believe they're small changes. They're not in any they're not major changes. They're just incremental changes.
Well, let me just take you back for a second to 1965 when the Auto Pact was signed, which basically put the two economies together in terms of the automotive industry. From that perspective, we had an integrated North American automotive industry, and since that time, really, the automotive industry in Canada has taken its lead from regulatory activity in the U.S. Rather than put in our own regulations, in some cases, in any event, we merely adopt those regulations through a memorandum of understanding that have been put in place in the United States already, the regulations that have been put in place in the United States already. So that process has worked well, and as I said in my remarks, I think the beneficiaries of that type of a process have been the consumers who have got the most technologically advanced vehicles, the safest vehicles at the lowest possible cost in the marketplace.
Okay. I guess, the question, and Ms. Anderson, if you can speak to that, is the standards that, or the common understanding is not the standards with vis-a-vis United States, but also comparing our standards with Mexico. And there's a discrepancy, a disparity in terms of the quality standards and regulations that we have in Canada versus, say, Mexico, and we start to harmonize those in small incremental changes. Does that overall improve our regulatory standards, or does that compromise Canada's position?
I think what you've addressed is actually an interesting one. Although the Security Prosperity Partnership has the opportunity to work within the NAFTA area, that is Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, it is possible that any two jurisdictions can work. So if they are more aligned or closer, they can work together, and there isn't the need to have all three
Correct,
at once. So I think this allows a leadership role in taking into effect ones that are already available and ready to go on.
Okay. Perfect. And just very quickly, I'm not sure how I'm doing time.
3 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So, Sparlow, you talked about very extensively water, and that's an issue that I raised in last committee as well, water diversion and the fact that selling Canada's water supply and making it North American, that is a major concern, and you wrote about that, and you've raised that in the past as well. Could you elaborate on how serious you think that is? I know you touched upon it in your comments, but when we spoke to witnesses in the past, and they said it wasn't on the table, it's not something serious. When you say it's going to be discussed in the foreseeable future, do you have an estimation of the timeline? Do you see how this will unfold, or is it sheer speculation?
Well, two things I would say. First of all, it's become quite clear only recently how serious the water crisis in the United States actually is. It's a new Environmental Protection Agency report that says that 36 states are in crisis. and the issue of water as a national security issue has moved up to the top of the political agenda in the United States. This same CSIS, the same group, the American Research Institute, that is the American component of this Futures 2025, was also tasked this same year to put something called the Global Water Futures together, which is a whole blueprint for the United States government on water, both water around the world where there are going to be conflicts, but also where the United States is going to get water. So suddenly the United States is looking at water like it's looking at energy and realizing that you can't be a superpower if you don't have both. So they are beginning to take this very, very seriously. And they're looking north to us, and they're looking south down to the Guarani Aquifer in South America are the two places. The concern that we have is that we don't have water to spare. It is a myth that we have 20% of the world's water. You'd have to drain every lake and river. We have about 7. More importantly, that water is in huge rivers that run north, in the north. So to shift to really move massive amounts of water, we would have to introduce huge engineering feats that would have to reverse the flow of that water, and it would have to be taken by pipeline. There's no other way that would be cost effective, and it would be very expensive, but so is running out of water, if you're a state like California. And I think that the openness with which the head of this team, this CSIS group in the United States, spoke to the media last week and said, yes, of course, we're interested in your water. What, does the sun come up in the morning kind of thing? I mean, he didn't even understand why there would be a concern about it. So and there was in October, the Global Water and Energy Strategy Team, which is a Washington-based group, was at a business meeting in Calgary, and they said there would be water flowing from northern Canada within 5 years. That was and they're working with some think tank groups and energy organizations in Manitoba, and they're talking about the first exports from northern Manitoba. So, I mean, I think the political resistance will hold it off for a while, but I think it's only a matter of time before we're really going to have a full-blown discussion.
What about
Thank you, Mr. Baines. Your time is up. We will go now to the Bloc Québécois. Monsieur André for 7 minutes.
I'm taking off my earpiece and you're putting yours on, I see, so that you can get the interpretation. Good morning, everyone. I was listening to your comments, Ms. Barlow, on water in particular. You know that at the moment, this is an item on some of the agendas of some American states to get water. And we have water. There are meetings coming up in the near future with the government to discuss this matter. The meeting will take place in Calgary to discuss the issue of water. Where are they at in your view? What is the status of the negotiations with respect to the sale of water? What's the current status there? Question 2. The Canadian Council of Chief Executives, well, they came in to talk about the SPP. They said that one of their objectives was to harmonize the health and social system in the 3 countries. However, when we look at the members and the SPP, a number of these companies in the CCE have branches in 3 countries. They're multinationals. So how can they defend both the interests of Canada and Quebec and at the same time try to further harmonize the healthcare system? Question 3. The dependency in your presentation, and the other witnesses could comment, you talked about our dependency on exports in terms of the United States. Some industries, such as agriculture, the manufacturing sector, I'm thinking in particular of furniture, software sectors, textiles also. In the furniture sector, there's a lot of export to the U.S., and there seems to be a trend to continue along these lines. There could be other markets that could be found. elsewhere, but we always seem to focus on the U.S. because that's what we've always done. Why are we still hesitating about finding other places to export our goods to? Why are we still involved in this free trade process with the U.S. without looking any further? Why aren't we into bilateral agreements with other countries? I will be answering in English, if you don't mind. I understand French, but I am more comfortable speaking English.
As always, our criticism of NAFTA, one of our criticisms of NAFTA was that it would place Canada in a very vulnerable position to have almost all of our exports, I think it's close to 87% now, going to the United States, so that we would then be helpless or in a very difficult position if ever there was a reason to close that border. And sure enough, this border has been closed. And as my colleagues here have said, it was even starting before 9/11. I would posit that with all we have offered and already given up under the SPP and other processes, it has not helped change that border situation. It's tighter than it ever was. As you know, the lineups for passports are so long, and they're now unmanned drones, American planes, warplanes between the Montana and Canadian borders, for instance. I mean, the border security is tightening, and everything we seem to do does not seem to change that. So it is a very serious problem. On your concern about harmonization, our concern around the regulatory convergence is not a more efficient way for my colleagues here to have a good trading system. That's not our concern. Of course, that makes sense. What our concern is that they're going to set up cross-border committees that are going to make decisions around regulations from seeds to food to healthcare to social programs to environmental standards that will then be not decided in the Canadian or Quebec parliaments, but rather by these cross-border committees. And it's an anti-democratic process. Further, if you look at the regime of George Bush, since he came to power, he has deregulated massively in everything from energy to automobile standards to environment. The conservation group said that he has cut 400 environmental programs, for instance. So we are harmonizing to a superpower that has massively deregulated in many, many areas. And of course, then there's the problem of having Mexico in the mix as well. So we're not talking here about sensible harmonization. Nobody could be opposed to that. But we are talking about setting up a process of moving into a race to the bottom. On the current status of water, here's the situation. Under NAFTA, we are not forced to export our water. However, once we do start exporting, once any province starts to export its water, the terms of NAFTA come into being. And NAFTA defines water as a good. And you're not allowed, under the terms of a trade agreement, to stop the import or export of a good for any reason, even environmental or conservation. So if any province decides to start exporting commercial exports of our water to the United States, the terms of NAFTA say that we can't, Canadian government can't then come in and say, no, you can't do that. Now, Mr. Baird last week said that Canada had a ban on the export of water. He probably thinks we do, but we don't. What we have is a voluntary agreement with the provinces, which are a mishmash, and any one of them, not all of them have signed it, any one of them could break it, and if anyone breaks it, then that water is open from all the provinces to whatever corporations got into that one province. Moreover, they only banned the transfer of transboundary waters from the Canadian side. But the Americans aren't interested in transboundary water. They're taking what they need from the Great Lakes through the new annex. What they really want is that water in those rivers going north, and that's not touched by this. We need a National Water Act in this country. We need water taken out of NAFTA as an investment, as a good. We need to protect this most precious resource politically, ecologically, and for future generations.
Thank you, Ms. Barlow. Thank you, Merci, Monsieur Andre. Your time is up. To Mr. Cannon from the government side for 7 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our presenters this morning, and appreciate your advice and words of wisdom. As the speaker alluded to, we've been studying this for a few meetings and trying to provide some direction for our government and all our small manufacturing enterprising businesses throughout Canada who we are very concerned about protecting jobs for all Canadians. And I congratulate you, Ms. Anderson, for your 75th year of business and your organization. And I look forward to hearing some more from a couple of questions I have. But I also want to set the record straight. There's a lot of fear-mongering from organizations like Ms. Barlow's, and it reminds me, I was looking at this German proverb, fear makes the wolf bigger than she really is. And the fact is that this Security and Prosperity Initiative isn't some kind of scary treaty or secret agreement. It's basically a series of common sense discussions with our neighbors. We're trying to work together, and if you have a cordial relationship with your next door neighbor, it's a lot better than adversarial, and I think this is what we're trying to do. You need to also realize that about 80% of Canadians live within 160 kilometers of our border, and that's what we're looking at, close to $2 billion worth of trade that transfers across the border daily, and those are those jobs of men and women, Canadians, that we're trying to protect. You know, right in my own riding, Kelowna Lake Country in the interior of British Columbia, we're not afraid of a seamless border. Matter of fact, we're looking for a more efficient border, because for small business folks, it's an efficient border helps, it saves money. I've got a candle distributor. It took 10 days to hold up their distribution at the border. Another manufacturer that you'll be looking for on your shelves in the grocery store, I put a little plug in. It's called Beaver Buzz. It's taking on Red Bull. It's an energy drink stuck at the border for days, and it costs money for small enterprises that are trying. These aren't large corporations. These are independent business folks that have broken up as entrepreneurs and invested their hard-earned money, and they want to work with Canada and Mexico and the U.S., work together. So I think you need to set the record straight and not send out these fear-mongering literature that you do, and it's very disturbing as Canada is trying to work together in a cooperative manner. So I'd like to ask the members from Mr. Anderson, Ms. Anderson and Mr. Adams specifically that do you believe that we need to work closely and collaboratively with the United States to form a strong North American foundation and create borders that are impervious to security risks, but that are thin and non-disruptive for trade and investment to ensure the seamless movement of goods and services?
Ms. Anderson, go ahead first, please.
Well, I certainly agree with your comments, and thank you very much. I think that we are fortunate to live where we do, geographically positioned to the largest economy in the world, and that does allow us the options and opportunities, even from small enterprises that are along the border to those of the interior, to export their products and create and develop wealth. So I think that this particular program of the SPP is one that really does accelerate opportunities to look at ways in which we can harmonize, and there are opportunities for improvements. I think you also raise an excellent point that it's very much on a consultative arrangement among colleagues and friends where you can get more open dialogue and discussion to develop consensus in terms of excellent solutions. So I see this as an ongoing opportunity for us in Canada to take ideas from the business community. We are a group of small, medium, and large enterprises, and we have been consulted. We can bring our ideas forward so that we can have borders that work. And I totally agree that there are issues related to the border, and it is something that we need to address to thin that border so that we can have access to work collaboratively with our U.S. colleagues, especially with other government departments. And I understand that you've touched on a couple that are very dear to us as well. We would like to look at, for example, some of the areas in opportunities with groups in the United States like the FDA, which we might be able to develop a way of looking at allowing FDA accreditation to more labs, which would, for example, create expediency if they need to do sample analysis so it doesn't take six weeks. So I think when we create an open dialogue and discussion, we can come up with creative solutions. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Adams, go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's to your point. automotive investment, the automotive industry is important to Canada. Automotive investment is critical to Canada. And I think one of the things that we want to ensure, to your point, is that we don't have a situation where the border becomes an issue in terms of where multinational corporations decide to place their investment. Surely it makes sense to have a border that is seamless, that goods can move back and forth across the border in an expeditious manner, unencumbered. Because I think we were fortunate to have the newest automotive plant investment in 20 years going into Woodstock from Toyota. I think we want to make sure that we have a situation that's set up where we can encourage more of that investment in Canada and not have it go solely into the United States.
Would it be all right if I come?
You have about a minute and a half. Ms. Barlow, the question was directed to...
I just have one supplemental. Thanks. I know I'm very passionate about this because it does affect individuals in my own community and across the country. And I just wanted to, if Ms. Anderson, you mentioned about the e-manifest program. Minister Day, who I share a boundary with my ridings, he's the I made an announcement in January about $400 million put into this e-manifest program. Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit more on how you think that's going to help some of your members as well as Canadian businesses?
I'd like to mention that Carol Osmond will respond to that, as she's been actively involved in that.
Oh, sorry. The e-manifest program, or the advanced commercial information, is actually one of the key priorities of our association. It's something that's been talked about for 10 years or more. It's not a new initiative. What e-manifest involves is the advanced transmission of information to the Canada Border Services Agency before the means of the mode of transportation reaches our border, reaches our ports. That will allow the Canada Border Services Agency to do its risk analysis before goods reach the border and decide which of those shipments need to be inspected. What our members are supportive of that initiative, and what they're looking for is to speed the process of entry of goods into Canada. As part of that process, the United States is implementing a similar program. And so what we are trying to do is to ensure that the program we implement in Canada is consistent with the program implemented in the United States. Canadian carriers, for example, have made it very clear that they do not want to have two separate programs. So this is an example of where working with the United States will reduce the cost for Canadian business and ensure that we're not trying to comply with two different programs, investing in two different types of systems and so on. And in terms of some of the points that were referred to earlier about it not being a democratic process, in the case of e-manifest, there was a consultation meeting back in January. There were 150 people that attended that consultative session. While there have been discussions between CBSA and CBP in the United States in terms of sharing lessons learned in terms of how they've implemented that system in the U.S., we're also setting up our own consultative framework in Canada so that Canadian business can be consulted, and small business as well as larger companies, so that the system works for Canadians. And also, if there are any regulations that need to be passed, and we anticipate that there will also be legislative changes, those will have to be brought before the Parliament of Canada. So these decisions are not just made in working groups between Canada and the United States.
Thank you very much, Ms. Osmond, and thank you, Mr. Cannon. Now we will go to the New Democratic Party. Mr. Julian for 7 minutes.
Well, thank you to all witnesses coming before the committee. Thanks particularly to you, Ms. Barlow. You just received a very, very clear compliment. Though Mr. Cannon's very rude tirade, he refused to give you an opportunity to reply, which I think shows that he's concerned, as are the Conservatives. They're concerned about the real agenda getting out. Because what's very clear from testimony last Thursday and today is that this is far beyond an issue just around smart borders, that there's a whole variety of elements of public policy that are involved. And what I found most compelling about your testimony is the comment from the U.S. Embassy that there was no appetite for a real public debate. It is exactly the same words that were used by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives last Thursday. So they're using the same messaging, which is there's no appetite, which I gather means they don't want the real agenda to get out in the public, implicitly stating that they're concerned that Canadians would reject this agenda, that they knew the extent, that it's far beyond smart borders, that it touches on energy sovereignty, water exports, and a whole variety of other issues, including the protections that we take for granted as Canadians. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to reply to Mr. Cannon, since he refused to allow you a rebuttal. And I'd also like you to answer the question why you think the Conservatives are so scared about this agenda getting out for public debate. If it was such a useful process, why are they scared of having that public debate, public consultation, parliamentary review of this very widespread and profound agenda?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Julian. Thank you very much for the opportunity to respond to my friend here. I was just actually thinking when you spoke that this was an initiative undertaken by the Liberals before you, and had they been in power now, you probably would have been sitting here with me criticizing it. However, I think it's important for us to say that we are, Canada will never be impervious to the United States and to a border concerns post 9/11 unless we make our border so benign that it's like crossing from Vermont to New Hampshire. As long as we maintain the sovereign right to make our own policy decisions in any way, the United States is going to continue to make that border crossing difficult. Nobody here likes that, nobody here wants that, but that's the reality that we're dealing with. And I also want to say that this is not about building, if this is about building a new North American reality, why has it been only the big business or even some of the medium-sized businesses that have been involved? Why has there been no negotiation or discussion with other groups? There are many, many people in this country who are working with Americans. We work very closely with many Americans on an alternative vision for the environment, for instance. There are many Americans who would like to have a national health care program. There are many Americans who are concerned about the assault on human rights and civil liberties in the United States under the Bush administration. There are many Americans who don't like what their government is doing in Iraq, and many of us are very concerned about what our government is doing in Afghanistan as well. And we have common cause and would like to have these negotiations opened up. We want the current SPP stopped so that we could start to have a different kind of dialogue. When we met with the U.S. Embassy, they said that when Condoleezza Rice was in town, the politicians did meet for some time by themselves. Then the members of the North American Competitiveness Council met down the hall, and they didn't meet together till a little later. Well, and so he was using this as proof that somehow the big business community does not have special privilege. Well, where were we? Where were people who care about education or health care or human rights or foreign policy or the environment? They have not been part of this process. And so I think that the concern that this get out is exactly what was expressed to us by the U.S. Embassy, is if Canadians knew what was in this agreement, if they had a chance to debate it, really look at it, and vote on it, they would say no to it. I deeply believe that. And I just want to say quickly that I have notes here from Ralph Pentland. Ralph Pentland wants to come before you if you are going to extend these hearings. He was the Director of Water Planning and Management at the branch of Environment Canada for 13 years. He wrote the policy that was hopefully to be adopted by the Mulroney government but didn't get adopted. And he's co-chaired several international joint commission boards. He's very, very knowledgeable on water. And he asked me to share with you here that he is deeply concerned about this process because and he is nonpartisan, because he feels very strongly that he's watched this happen before with the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and then NAFTA, where committees like this met and we were assured water wouldn't become part of NAFTA, and then it was. And more recently, where the negotiations took place on the annex to the 1909 Shared Boundary Water Treaty between Canada and the United States, where there were negotiations that were never going to open up diversions to the Great Lakes, and we were assured this happened. Governments took their hands off it and let these negotiations take place at other levels, and we have a new annex that allows new diversions for communities and corporations off the Great Lakes Basin, and many of us are deeply concerned that there's going to be water takings from the U.S. side. So here we have another process that's now taking place outside of Parliament potentially around water exports from Canada's north. And we feel very, very strongly that we have to have a debate. We may not be right, but let's have a debate, and let's have more than just Tom DeKino, who originally not only came up with this concept, but actually had the title of their recommendations was the North American Security and Prosperity Initiative. It was actually the same title, except it changed from initiative to partnership when the three governments signed. This is their blueprint. They went down to the White House right after 9/11 happened, and we're told, what have you got to offer if you want to keep that border open? This is a dialogue for all Canadians. This is not a partisan issue. This should be an issue of true and deep debate in this country, and we have members from all parties, by the way, in our organization.
I want to come to the issue of energy sovereignty, because right now Canada actually shares under the proportionality clauses of NAFTA. We actually supply the American market before we supply Canadians. And that proportionality clause means if there's a supply shortage, Canadians literally freeze in the dark while we supply the American market. If they are going further, or if the plans on the North American resource strategy is to go even further, what would that mean for the strategic control that Canada should exercise over its oil and gas resources? And does any other country give preferential supply to another country before it supplies its own citizens?
Ms. Barlow, you have about 15 seconds to
Okay,
answer.
just quickly, no, we have given away our energy sovereignty, and those of us looking at this wondered what more you could give away than NAFTA. I think it's ownership of and control of the tar sands to American corporations, and the agreement not to implement a different environmental regime from the United States, so that it's one seamless border, or one non-existing border when it comes to energy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Julian. Now, for the 5-minute questioning round, we start with the official opposition with Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Osmond, if the e-manifest strategy was made compulsory, would that be an answer to the latest development in the U.S. where pre-clearance has been nixed by the American administration?
Well, e-manifest will become mandatory. It's a program that's being phased in over time as we bring in. Currently, it's in place, for example, for maritime carriers and for the air mode. We're now looking at implementing it at the land border, and ultimately importers as well will have to transmit information electronically in advance. My understanding of the issue relating to pre-clearance relates to it's a different issue, and it relates to individuals who would approach the border that would want to enter the United States. And the United States wants the ability, if someone decides to turn around, if they're a suspect, if they suspect, for example, that they're probing the border, testing the border, that they want to be able to question those individuals and possibly fingerprint those individuals. That's something that the Canadian government has said, that if somebody wants to turn around, then they should have the opportunity to do that without being fingerprinted by the United States.
But there's still both programs require perhaps with e-manifest you put all there's assessment before that truck reaches the border.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And similarly, I appreciate what you're saying about why the U.S. have objected to that, but that would still, with the pre-manifest strategy, that would still be implemented, the pre-clearance problems?
Yeah, they're really separate issues. The pre-clearance involves U.S. officials being on the Canadian side of the border, whereas e-manifest, going in both directions. I mean, currently e-manifest, it going into the United States is already being implemented, and involves transmitting data in advance to U.S. Customs authorities relating to the driver as well as the carrier and the vehicle that's being carried. But I don't think that addresses U.S. concerns about being able to apprehend someone on the Canadian side of the border.
But
sorry,
okay.
Maybe I'm not understanding the question.
The e-manifest strategy or program, by that time the truck is already in the United States, correct?
Well, he's not in the United States. The information is transmitted to the United States. Then the driver arrives at the customs inspection booth. The U.S. has that data in advance. What the e-manifest allows the U.S. to have that information before the driver arrives. It allows them to risk assess the data with respect to the driver and with respect to the cargo, and decide whether or not there's a reason for that person, whether they could have an interest in the individual or they could have an interest in the cargo that they're carrying.
And the decision is made to inspect or not inspect.
Right, they could, right. Mm-hmm.
My concern is we have to look at alternatives. I'm not happy that we're going to make any more headway with our U.S. Colleagues on these issues with WHTI and with the pre-clearance. So I'm looking for, is there any reasonable alternative that could be considered?
Well, I think, the issue with respect to with pre-clearance relates to space on either side of the border. We want to be able to expand sort of inspection facilities, that sort of thing, to facilitate the movement of goods. Unfortunately, in the case of, the Peace Bridge, there's limited space on the U.S. side of the border. On the Canadian side, we have the issues with Thousand Islands, and we have a shortage of space. But my understanding is unless we move in one country, we're not going to move in the other. My understanding is that, the Peace Bridge, there was a need for a decision to be made so that the Bridge Authority could proceed with its construction plans and its development at the bridge. So it's unlikely now that we will have a pre-clearance facility at the Peace Bridge. However, I think in both countries we would like to see the governments to continue to discuss this issue, and hopefully it could happen at other border crossings on both sides of the border.
Ms. Barlow, you struck a chord with bulk water sales here this morning. You suggested that we'd have a National Water Act, which in essence would prohibit cross-border bulk sales or cross-border bulk importation whatsoever. Does that conflict with NAFTA, and what do we have to go back and renegotiate NAFTA on that issue?
Yes, it does conflict with NAFTA, because NAFTA, in NAFTA, water is a commercial good as well as an investment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Maloney. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you had answered. Mr. Maloney's out of time. He's a minute over, so a very short answer. I thought you had actually answered the question.
Just very clearly, yes, it does conflict with NAFTA, but in our view, the United States has broken NAFTA by not abiding by the softwood lumber rulings, and therefore we feel that it is perfectly legitimate for Canada to take a stand on the areas of NAFTA that don't work for Canada. We should ban bulk water exports, and which means breaking that piece of NAFTA's our commitment under NAFTA.
Thank you, Mr. Maloney. Monsieur Cardin, for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Last week, we had some witnesses here, and I asked them how much consultation went into the SPP. I didn't get much of an answer on that. And Ms. Barlow, perhaps you can give me some information. Well, when we look at what was said at the initial meetings, we talked about consulting stakeholders, the business sector, government, and NGOs. Based on your experience, did anyone ask for your view about the SPP?
Was the American Embassy 2 weeks ago. They invited us to the bunker to chat. We invited them back to our office instead. Nobody from the government, either the previous government or this one, has asked anyone that I know, not just us, any environmental group, any education group, any healthcare organization. All of our groups are in the dark on this. In fact, 2 years ago, we held a cross-country citizens inquiry into Canada-U.S. relations. We had a very, very good representation. We had members as citizens juries hearing the testimony from all political parties, by the way. And what we heard from Canadians from all over the country and from Quebec was that they did not know anything about this process. So we held our own inquiry that gave them an opportunity to say what kind of continent they would like, what values in this North American space, shared space, that they would like. And we heard from all sorts of groups, including small business, who felt left out of it too. But the common thread that we heard over and over was, we're so glad to have a place to speak to this because nobody has asked our opinion on it. This process was guided by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives and the C.D. Howe Institute and the Liberal government at the time, and has been handed in that form to this government, which has, in my opinion, deepened the commitments.
C'est certain que pour le PSP,
in the case of the SPP, trade is important, and we noticed in the witnesses' comments from the international automobile manufacturers and the importers and imports, trade needs to be seamless. We don't have a problem with that, but the only problem is when there's a conflict with standards, because there are certain values in Canada and Quebec which are not the same in the United States. So certain things can be traded easily, but others raise more issues. I'd like to come back to the issue of water. You were saying that Canada should change its position, the position adopted in April 2002 at the Human Rights Commission, that water be considered a human right. Should we assume that it agreed to consider water as a good, a tradable good? But if it is a human right, without going so far as to talk about bulk exports, there could be some minimum trade in water, but NAFTA covers all goods that are explicitly mentioned within the agreement. But water is not mentioned. In Canada, there are 9 provinces out of 10 that protect their water resources and that have legislation that forbid bulk exports. And the Implementation Act of NAFTA does mention that there would be no export of bulk water, as I recall. So then Canada should make some official representations to make this clearer, that bulk water exports is really not part of NAFTA.
You won't see the word water in NAFTA. What you'll see is the reference to the definition of a good that was in the old General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. When you go to that, you see water in all its forms, including ice and snow. NAFTA adopted the GATT, the old GATT tariff notion of a good. So water is absolutely, definitely in NAFTA. And it supersedes the provincial laws. Not one of the provincial bans on water exports would stand up to a NAFTA challenge. We have to remove water as a good, an investment, and a service in NAFTA. We need to do that. And it is a shame, I am ashamed when I go to the United Nations, that our government continues to oppose the right to water at the United Nations. We got a rebuke last year from a subcommittee of the United Nations for Canada's continued appalling position. The United Kingdom just changed its position. It is now favoring the right to water, as are most countries in the world. And I believe the reason that we continue to oppose the right to water is because we know it would violate NAFTA and the notion of water as a good in NAFTA. So for that reason, to join the community of nations moving towards a right to water convention, Canada needs to change its position on water, protect it ecologically and politically.
Merci, Monsieur Cardin. Now to the government side, to Mr. Lemieux for 5 minutes.
And thank you to our guests here today. Seeing as how we've just been talking about bulk water, I'd like to clarify. There's a lot of speculation in the media in particular regarding bulk water and the sale of bulk water, etc. So I'd like to say, first of all, that the Government of Canada has no intention of entering into negotiations on bulk water products. And in fact, the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act prohibits bulk removals from boundary basins. And Canada is committed to protecting water in its natural state. The second thing I'd like to point out is that water in its natural state is not a good. Bulk water is not a good under NAFTA. Water in its natural state is not subject to trade agreements. And I'll just finish this off by saying that Canadian provincial governments have full sovereignty over the management of water resources, and they're not subject to trade agreements. So I want to bring that out. And lastly, I think, because a lot of the speculation comes from these studies that are being done by private think tanks. And I think private think tanks are able to operate on their own. They're able to do whatever studies they like. But that does not mean that they have government support or even that they have government interest. So, and I think this is where a lot of this speculation is coming from. It's being reported that think tanks are launching studies. Well, go ahead. But it doesn't reflect on government or government policy or government position. It's think tanks. To move on, I'd like to thank Mr. Adams for his presentation. I thank you as well for your positive comments regarding our report. And I'd like to acknowledge your support of some of the key recommendations that were contained within that report. In there you speak about basically the Canadian government having to focus on promoting trade negotiation and promoting export of products to the U.S., but also to other countries. And you also support Recommendation 12, which is the advancement of the Security and Prosperity Partnership talks that are going on right now. So you mentioned vehicle emission standards as being an example where progress, in fact, would be a good thing for your market. And I'm wondering if you could share with us how you see other security and prosperity partnership initiatives, because it's just initiatives that are going to come from this framework, specifically benefiting your industry. And if you might be able to share examples with us on how it would benefit your industry.
Some of the initiatives I have already outlined, particularly in the area of motor vehicle safety standards. We are largely harmonized with the United States right now, but there are some minor differences in about 40 motor vehicle safety standards at the moment. A simple one that I could offer as an example is the difference in bumper standards between Canada and the United States. Again, no real discernible reason why that should be the case. One has a 5-mile-per-hour bumper standard, and another has a 2.5-mile-per-hour bumper standard. But bringing those things together allows the product to be tested once, so it doesn't have to be tested twice. Again, in the area of emission standards, and I also made comment in the report that I didn't get to in my remarks about appreciated the committee's report about not only looking beyond our borders but also within our borders, and the need to have a harmonized approach to our regulatory regime within Canada. And I guess it would speak to that in terms of emission standards, as you alluded to, with respect to different provinces considering adopting, for instance, California emission standards, which has been a bit of a buzzword in terms of automotive emission standards these days. Clearly, our view is that the best benefit for all consumers is to avoid a patchwork quilt of regulation, both within Canada, within North America, have one common emission standard in place and one common fuel economy standard. So those are a few examples of how these types of, the SPP in particular, assists our industry.
Right.
Very good. And I wonder if I could ask Ms. Anderson the same question, which is basically, you know, we have the SPP, and it's a framework under which there are common sense discussions going on between industries to basically facilitate trade and other issues. So I wonder if you could elaborate for the committee where you see specific initiatives benefiting the industries that you work with and how it would benefit those industries.
Well, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on that. I think that, first of all, as a general perspective, that the opportunity within the SPP is one of dialogue, where it brings together a whole variety of ideas. And I think the value of it is that we have had on the table over 400, so that we do know that we have a lot of industry input on what issues need to be addressed, and very pragmatic issues, as Dave was alluding to, ones that, when harmonized, will also create better prosperity within all of our jurisdictions. I think that within our association, and we are one that, as I mentioned, includes small, medium, and large, as well as touches almost any industry with manufactured goods into a whole variety. We even include, for example, the Port of Vancouver, CN and CP, so it's quite an interesting group of, and all of those areas, all of those jurisdictions touches on regulations and regulation opportunities for looking at specific issues. One of the areas I think that I'd like to address, though, is probably within food products, and what I see here is an area that has a multitude of requirements and regulations, and there are areas related to food safety and food security that I think we need to look at very carefully, and we all have recognized some of the issues related to that. So we need to look at some ways in which we can track and trace products from where its point of origin to its final destination. I think there's some very intriguing ideas that can be done along that line to harmonize those ideas. I think, as well as I alluded to, there's some issues related to opportunities for looking at inspections. Other government departments are required in food products, a whole variety of government departments that touch on food. And going forward, I would welcome the opportunity for other government departments to be included in a consultation framework. I mentioned as well some of the challenges that Canadians have in exporting their products to the U.S. means that because they have inputs that are from other jurisdictions, for example, a blended product into the final product. So we have to track where that product originally comes. We need to develop, again, some transparency in where it's from and where it's finally going. But we also need to look at the framework in the U.S. within the FDA, requirements of looking at products that may have come from multiple places that are finally sold into the United States. The FDA right now requires a number of products that go across the border to be investigated or held back or looked at. And I would like to again say that I think that from our regulation perspective, there's lots of opportunities to see how we can streamline that process, expedite that process, as well as work with the U.S., for example, to expand the number of accredited labs that can inspect products so they aren't held up over a period of 6 weeks or so.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson, and thank you, Mr. Lemieux. To Mr. Julian for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back to you, Ms. Barlow, and ask you two questions, but I have some comments to make beforehand. One is the issue around prosperity, because this is something that comes as sort of rote from folks who are proponent of the SPP and proponents of NAFTA. They always say, gee, you know, Canada's prospered immensely over the past 15 years, but the figures from StatsCan actually tell a completely different story. Since 1989, the lowest income 20% of Canadians have seen their incomes collapse. They've lost a month's salary in real terms. So they're getting by now on 11 months' salary as opposed to 12. That next 20%, the working class, has lost 2 weeks' salary. The middle class has lost 2 weeks' salary. The upper middle class has seen absolutely no progress. Who's profited is the CEOs and chief executives. The wealthiest of Canadians have seen their income skyrocket. So Bruce Campbell, who testified last Thursday, said that essentially under NAFTA, the top 5% of income earners had reaped almost all the benefits, creating this massive prosperity gap where 80 to 90% of Canadian families are earning less now than they were in 1989. It's incredible that anyone would continue to propagate a myth when the figures are so compelling and so clear. So my question there is, why do we have an economic policy that leaves 80 to 90% of Canadian families behind? My second question is around protections, so regulations that we put in place to protect Canadians. I know you were involved in chasing back bovine growth hormone from Canada, something that was approved automatically in the United States because they don't have the same rigorous testing standards, and their system is much more prone to influence from powerful corporate lobbies. What do you think would be the implications or the impact of removing all of our abilities to set protections for Canadian families so that bad products that might be approved in the United States don't automatically come on the Canadian market?
Well, thank you for both those questions. We are very concerned about the social consequences of a merger of the size of the SPP coming out of NAFTA. We've watched our country change from looking like a large egg with a great big middle class to looking more like a pear, with more and more Canadians falling out at the bottom and fewer holding power at the top. And now the further we merge, the more we look like the United States. We're not as extreme in that difference between rich and poor, but it's getting there. And in recent research, I discovered that the greatest difference between rich and poor in the world is in the United States now. It's not in Mexico, it's not in Latin America, it's not in China, it's not in Africa. The top 10% control 2/3 of the wealth. So we would be merging into more deeply with a superpower that has basically abandoned the bottom 2/3 of its population. Very deeply concerned. On the bovine growth hormone issue, it's very interesting you should raise that, because I had written a note about this tested once. The conservative, several of the conservative MPs talked about the harmonization of our regulatory positions and standards. One of the provisions is this tested once provision, whereby if something has been given the go-ahead in the United States, we would not have the ability to have a separate regime here in Canada. And bovine growth hormone is the exact perfect example. We were able to stop it, and you should know it was a conservative senator, Senator Mira Spivak, who took it very, very seriously, held Senate committee hearings on it, and was very much responsible for helping us fight to keep bovine growth hormone out of Canada, which has been linked to cancer in tests with rats and so on. Our concern is that we will harmonize our policy around seeds, foods, chemicals, environment, energy, water, and so on, to the needs and concerns of the superpower that's 10 times bigger than us. It's not that they're bad people or anything, it is that they're bigger than us, and the big tend to suck in the smaller when you have this kind of situation. We need to maintain our sovereign rights on this side of the border. That does not mean we're anti-American. I can't stand it when anyone I know or I am called that, because I'm on the board of 3 American organizations. We have a different vision of what North America must look like and what we need to hold on to. We are not anti-trade. We hope that we continue to have wonderful trade relationships with the United States, but strong fences make good neighbors as well, and we need to protect ourselves on this side of the border.
And we've certainly seen in both the American midterm elections where there was a strong reaction to that kind of gutting of the middle class in the United States that many Americans are reacting to, as well as the Mexican elections where the PRD, according to many observers, actually won those elections. Again, a strong reaction to this economic policy where only the top 5% benefits, right, and the other 80-90% of Canadian or American or Mexican families are left behind. Should Canadian families then be concerned about putting into place a system where we automatically adopt whatever lower American standards are out there in regards to pharmaceutical products or food products, when we know that there's been a number of cases of scandals of products that should not have been put on the market, that were put on and were called afterwards? Should we not have those protections in place for Canadian families?
We absolutely should, and let me quote to you from this paper that we're going to be giving you from the North American and Future 2025 project. I've been talking about water, but it's full of many interesting things. They talk about, in order to remain competitive in the global economy, it is imperative for the 21st century North American labor market to possess the flexibility necessary to meet industrial labor standards on a transitional basis and in a way that responds to market forces. This demand will prompt policymakers in all countries to think creatively about prospective policy options. That sounds to me very much like what they're proposing with the Atlantica project in the in Atlantic Canada and the northern United States, where they're talking about bringing down the labor minimum wage and labor standards to the lowest of whichever jurisdiction has those lowest standards. So bringing those standards down. This is all about merging with a country that has cut welfare by 13% every year since George Bush took power in 2000. As one woman said to me, well, he has created lots of jobs. I myself have 3 of them. I mean, this is what life is like living under George Bush, and if that's what we want in this country, that's where we're headed. We're asking our legislators here to consider and listen to those Canadians, we think we're the majority, who want good relationships with our United States friends and neighbors. Many of us have family there, but we do not want to give away the right to maintain our own standards and one day influence the standards in that country to go higher.
Thank you, Ms. Barlow. Thank you, Mr. Julian. Now to the official opposition, Mr. Temelkovsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of the presenters. Last week we heard from some of the presenters that prior to 2001, the average time it took for goods to be transferred between the states and Canada was about 45 seconds, and now it's over 200 seconds. They also alluded that it was the solutions were going to be physical, such as more borders, such as more bridges, and so on and so forth. Do you think the problem is borders or hardware, or do you think it's legislative issues that have increased the time it takes to move goods and people across the borders? And that's to all of you.
Go ahead, Mr. Adams. You can lead off.
Yeah, I believe the numbers, if I'm not mistaken, from the Chamber suggested that since 2001 there's been a 300% increase in the time it takes to cross the border, and the cost associated with those measures is about $14 billion US. So there is definitely, I think, a challenge. I'm not sure that the prior to 2001 that challenge didn't exist already in terms of actually having the physical infrastructure in place to facilitate cross-border trade. I think what 9/11 did was brought laser focus to the issue and how we needed to look at developing some solutions. Situations like trying to address a new border crossing down in Windsor, those have been and continue to be long-term propositions that we hope will be resolved sooner rather than later. But putting a new bridge across a river does take time. Environmental assessments do need to be conducted. The proper legwork on both sides of the border needs to be undertaken. So I would suggest, I guess, it's a combination of both things. It's the physical infrastructure crossing the border, it's the infrastructure leading up to the border, and then the other element, as you suggest, would be the mechanisms, customs mechanisms, for instance, that are used to facilitate that cross-border trade. E-manifest, as Ms. Osmond mentioned, being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Barlow, briefly, please.
Well, I would just say that everyone recognizes that this is a problem, but we also recognize that it's a result of 9/11 and the very real concerns the United States has around border security. And I don't think there's very much that we can do that's going to change the new reality of the border. It should be worked on, of course, but at the same time, there is no way that our health care and our labor standards and our water and our control over our resources and our control over having our own regulatory and environmental and health standards should be put at risk in order to facilitate, 10 seconds. What's it going to take? 10 seconds off if we give up health care? What is it that we have to give? And that's the fear that Canadians have, is that there's one sector driving this. We're not saying that the sector isn't important. It's tremendously important, and of course these issues matter. But if this sector is driving everything else, and we're all expected to give up everything else for this transborder crossing of goods and services, it's too great a price, and it won't work.
Ms. Anderson, do you want to respond, or Ms. Osmond?
I just wanted to make a distinction between the time it takes for customs clearance versus the time it actually takes to get to the customs booth, because I think generally what we're measuring is the time for customs clearance. Now, that I think those times do tend to be a little bit longer going into the United States than they are coming into Canada. But the longer time frames are the time, and Mr. Adams mentioned this, is the time to actually get to the customs booth. And that, certainly for our members, is the bigger concern. Because of the lack of infrastructure, the need for new bridges, for example, in the Windsor-Detroit area, also the infrastructure leading up to the entry points, and also so those are probably the key issues, is the infrastructure leading up to the border crossings. But there are also issues related to inspections, and as Ms. Anderson referenced, there are concerns with the Food and Drug Agency in the United States and the inspection process on the U.S. side of the border, and that's a concern as well.
Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Andre for about 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ms. Barlow. Mr. Lemieux's comments. He was trying to reassure us. He was saying that we shouldn't be concerned about the water export issue, and that within NAFTA at the moment, water was really protected, that there was really no political will to move toward exporting water. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Should we continue to be concerned, or did it reassure you?
Monsieur, it certainly made me happy to hear you say that the government will never allow bulk water exports. So that was a good thing, and we will quote you all over the place. But Mr. Lemieux is wrong in saying that NAFTA does not impact on the provinces and does not take precedence. A treaty between two countries signed by the federal government of those two countries is the overarching legislation. It implies everything and involves everything about the provinces. Of course, the provinces don't have a higher jurisdiction than a treaty. I have here in my hand all of the legislations in the different provinces. They're a mishmash. Some provinces don't. New Brunswick has nothing, and they mean nothing if you get a new premier who decides to export water. And I'll give you a perfect example. Several years ago, Premier Grimes of Newfoundland decided to export water from Gisborne Lake. And we had a huge hue and cry. We spent a lot of time speaking to Newfoundlanders, and they spent a lot of time speaking to themselves. They said, we've got so much water, and we reminded them that they once said that about the cod, right? And that was a good argument that seemed to resonate. David Anderson, who was the environment minister at the time, said to Mr. Grimes, and this was reported, that NAFTA takes precedence over provincial water exports, and if any province starts exporting water for commercial purposes, it impacts the whole country. And he traveled to Newfoundland and asked Mr. Grimes to reconsider, because this was going to put Canada in jeopardy under NAFTA. Ralph Pentland, who is considered Canada's leading authority, senior bureaucratic authority, he's retired now, on water issues, is very, very clear that water is in NAFTA, as are all the legal opinions that you will find from everybody on all sides of the border. When I mean border, I mean the political border. And we even met with lawyers from the Canadian government when the Liberals were in power, and they all said the same thing. Water is in NAFTA. You don't see the word. You have to go to the old General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs to get the definition of a good, and there it is. It is in there as an investment, and let me just end by saying the water that is being destroyed in the tar sands right now, and we know that for every unit of oil that's extracted from the tar sands, between 3 and 5 units of water is actually lost to the hydrologic cycle. If any government, the Alberta or the federal government in Canada, were to try to regulate this and say to the American corporations there, this is terrible, you're destroying our water, they could sue currently under NAFTA for reparations. They could say now, you owe us compensation because you've changed the rules. That's the Chapter 11 investor state rights. So NAFTA already applies to any water usage being used by American corporations in Canada. So it's already a problem, and it is past time for us to deal with this problem.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur Andre. For about a minute and a half, Mr. Cannon.
I'm going to share my time with Mr. Merrifield, but that's not much time. I thought we still have 15 minutes.
No, we are going to committee business in about a minute.
Well, I'd just like to thank the witnesses, and before I wanted to clarify a couple of comments that were made that, and I appreciate, as I mentioned, the e-manifest and excuse me, I got a little frog in my throat. Excuse me. What we heard today is the concerns that excuse me, have been tabled from Ms. Barlow and Mr. Julian. I just got to get on the record the fact that he's a master of manipulating the facts, and the report that he referred to contains a lot of good news, which inevitably underplays the Canadian economy, doubled in size in the past 25 years. Average real family earnings increased from $60,000 to $70,000 from the late 70s to the early 2000s. The poor are demonstrably not getting poorer. Indeed, according to the report's own statistics, the poorest 10% of families with children are 8% better off in real terms than they were 25 years ago. And the other factual information I'd like to get on the record is just comment about the democratic process in the Mexican government. I think his comments are outrageous and totally out of line, and I think he should apologize. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Thank you all for coming today. Appreciate your comments and your answers to questions very much. So thank you, and we will go now to about a 2-minute break, and we'll come back to committee business. If the MPs could just let the witnesses clear as quickly as possible so we can get to committee business.
In camera.